going out there, everybody? Gun Psychiatrist here, and in this probably next series of videos, I am going to cover all the bases when it comes to hydrographics. This is going to be dedicated video training for hydrographics, but we also have to cover automotive painting, since automotive painting is a large part of doing hydrographics. The following course materials that we're going to be using are from my personally created training curriculum. I had to do this for certain successors for my previous hydrographics business. A little bit about myself. I hold a certification from TWN Industries, which is one of the larger hydrographic suppliers. I've had my certification probably for about 3-4 years now. Been at it a while. Haven't really done hydrographics in about the last year or so. Once you get it in your blood and you figure out what exactly it is that you're doing, that's when hydrographics starts to get fun and you stop ripping out all your hair. And what I mean by that is the biggest thing going into hydrographics that I always had a problem with was you never understand what you're doing wrong. When you dip something, after you wash it, there's a lot that the film is telling you right there. Even after you paint something before you go to dip, there's a lot that can happen with the paint on the substrate that's going to tell you what's going on. If you're doing something wrong with painting, it's going to show up in your paint work. And it's critical for anybody out there to be able to identify these issues and correct them before it's too late. These training courses are going to be a little bit long videos because I'm going to dive in full-fledged and really lay out all of the problems, so that way if you have problems come up, whether you're painting or doing hydrographics or dipping, what have you, you're going to be able to actually recognize what's going on. And this is really going to help you. Honestly, it doesn't substitute much for hands-on training, which I'd love to do, but we're going to go ahead and dive in this. The first portion I want to kind of cover equipment, and then in the next portion we're going to get into automotive painting and how to recognize issues that can come up with paint, and then probably in subsequent videos we'll get into actual hydrographics process and identifying problems with hydrographics there. So in this section, we're going to cover the basics of automotive paint, equipment setup, preparation, application techniques, and other rules of engagement. All guns, and the guns that I prefer to use for hydrographics are more or less a budget line gun. They're going to allow you to not break the bank when getting set up when first started doing paint or hydrographics. And one thing I like to do is equip all my guns on the DeVilbiss D-cup system, which allows for a quick disconnect hopper to be attached on, and there's little plastic paint cups that go in the system. The whole system really allows for faster color changes, reduced acetone consumption for cleaning, and practical storage of your guns, because you can keep acetone on top of them and always keep acetone in your gun, thus reducing any downtime of your paint guns or what have you. I highly recommend the system. It's a little extra to get into. Just the amount of acetone you will go through when you don't have a D-cup system is absolutely ridiculous. So the guns that I prefer to use are the starting line DeVilbiss guns. The starting line primer gun comes with a 1.8 millimeter tip. The starting line paint gun comes with a 1.3 millimeter tip. Optimal operation for these guns. Your primer gun is going to run about 30 to 45 PSI. Which is going to be about 3 to 5 turns of flow for the paint control nozzle or the paint control valve. The paint gun is going to like about 28 to 45 PSI at 1 to 4 turns of flow. And then, of course, when you're painting metallics, you're going to want to run around 38 to 40 PSI. Then you can adjust your flow accordingly as far as volume of paint running through your gun. And it's important to remember that proper and consistent atomization of metallic mica pigments is critical to matching paint and performing consistent work. And I use this 38 to 40 PSI number because when I used to work in my dad's body shop, one of his painters always had told me, when you shoot metallic paints, shoot them around 38 to 40 PSI. Now, I was back in the late 90s, early 2000s, but I've always just kind of held true to that. And I'm sure there's other painters out there that might disagree, what have you, but that's what I always go with. So why is that important? When you're spraying a metallic paint, what makes it metallic are fine aluminum pigments called mica pigments, and that mica makes it sparkle. And when you're spraying that on there, the way they atomize and they hit the surface of the substrate that you're spraying, the pattern in which they hit that surface is really regulated by the amount of PSI coming out of your gun. You can do a whole job and decide that, hey, I want to shoot the rest of this job at 30 PSI. you're going to have a noticeable difference in the way those pigments appear in the sunlight, and or you're going to have a complete mismatch. And so I just prefer to say, hey, look, keep it at 38 to 40 PSI. That 2 PSI allows for a margin of error. And as long as you keep it at that, your metallics are always going to come out. A lot of times people use metallics on Hydrographics. Hydrographics has a transparent background, and the metallics bleed through that transparent background and give some pretty cool effects, especially on carbon fibers and other things. This is what your gun looks like. Obviously with 31 and 29, which is the cup that goes on top of the gun, you would do away with that if you were using a D-cup system. You know, the first part going from left to right, you're going to have the nozzle, which is going to be part number 01. You're going to have the gasket that seals that off. You're going to have the actual nozzle tip, which is part number 02. You know, you're going to have the main body and all these little components. The reason I'm showing this, there's going to come a point in time to where you're going to have to clean your guns. And you want to do this maybe about once a week, to where you pull them all apart, get every bit of paint out of them, and then put them all back together using a little bit of lubricant. And this is going to be the best way to make sure you don't lose anything, is to make sure you have all these parts and possibly keep some extra ones on hand in case an O-ring goes bad or what have you. That way you can minimize downtime. But I just wanted to show this so you understand what the gun looks like and what you're looking at. When cleaning, it's best to fully disassemble and clean guns weekly or after heavy painting usage. Do not remove the seals unless replacing them or removing excess paint. That's also critical because you can crack them or what have you. Clean and well-maintained equipment will produce exceptional work. That is a key point that I want all of you to understand. If you're using an airbrush, which in Hydrographics you're probably going to want to use an airbrush, you're going to need one, and I would get a good one. And be prepared to drop about $200 on an airbrush. Because if you buy one of those cheesy Harbor Freight ones, it's going to produce cheesy Harbor Freight results on what could be very spectacular work. That's going to look cheap, and it's going to affect your brand name and your reputation. So good equipment, good technique, and lots of practice can equate to excellent quality of work. Clean your airbrush after each use. And one thing I like to do when cleaning guns is I spray acetone, get all the paint out, and then I'll spray clean acetone through them. And wherever the air comes out and the fluid comes out, I will squeeze it to where I get full fluid flow and then put my finger over that tip just slightly to where it actually backflows through the paint system, allowing acetone and air to kind of work out anything that might be stuck in there. And that way, if you get any, paint pigments or what have you come up through there, you can dump it out and clean those out. But always back flush through the system by running the air and putting your finger over the nozzle. Another thing that's critical is you need to thoroughly clean your clear coat gun after each use. I'm not saying that you need to fully pull it apart, but you need to wipe it down. Clear coat is very sticky, it's very nasty, and it will ruin your equipment over time if it's allowed to go unchecked. And the best way to do this is with a rag with acetone. I usually prefer microfiber cloths. Exceptionally great cleaning tools, especially when it comes down to paint, because it can really get into a lot of areas that a general terry cloth won't get into. The microfiber with some acetone on it will clean your gun and make it look like brand new. And all the guns that I had, because I used about 6 or 7 different spray brick guns in my last operation, they look like they just came out of the box. They were brand new, and I had used them for years. So take good care of your equipment, guys. So your activator gun should be cleaned monthly with acetone. And I'll get into the activator gun later in a separate video because I use a certain spray gun just for activator. That's a pretty sensitive process to Hydrographics, so I'm going to keep that out of this. I just wanted to make a note of that since we were talking about cleaning equipment. Clean spray booth area weekly or after a heavy painting, especially with clear coat. Remove any excess dust and particles from hoses, sidewalls, floors, etc. to prevent FOD, which is called foreign objects debris. And we're going to discuss that a little bit more in the painting operations section, because when you have wet paint, it can get contaminated really easy from FOD in the air, especially if you don't have a industrial spray booth or what have you. So that's one thing. If you keep a clean house, you will have clean paint. Keep all equipment away from the spray area. So don't store your guns in your spray booth. Don't store paint in your spray booth. Don't, keep spray booth things to spray booth things, because it gets nasty in there. So the next thing I want to talk about is common terms and problems associated with automotive paint. The first thing that we need to understand is what atomization is, because when we pour paint into a cup on our gun, the gun with suction or gravity flow, takes the paint and atomizes it into the air into a pattern that we spray down on a substrate. Atomization is basically the process of breaking up paint, bulk liquid, into fine droplets. So when we're thinking of atomization, the better atomization we get, the better our finished product. Stage. This is another thing important, because if you start actually doing hydrographics professionally, you're going to need to know this term. Stage is a term that we use when referring to base coats. There's single stage paints, there's two stage paints, there's three stage paints. For example, a single stage paint is a paint that is not going to need a clear coat. It already has the UV inhibitors in it. It's 9 times out of 10, it's going to be epoxy cured, and it's not going to require any clear coat. A two-stage paint uses a base coat, then has a clear coat applied over the base coat. And 90% of the, well, I'm not going to say 90%, but a vast majority of most of your urethane paints that you put on cars, especially with solid colors, your reds, your yellows, your blacks, your blues, your greens, all that, those are what's known as two-stage paints. There's an air-curing urethane that goes over a primer. That would be the first stage, and then your second stage is going to be your clear coat that goes over the top of that. And that would seal that off and protect it from fading and UV damage and all that fun stuff that you see on the road. Three-stage paints use a base coat followed by an intermediate top coat and then a clear coat. So this is going to be really common when you're using certain metallics. Pretty much all candy colors use this type of three-stage paint. For example, white pearl metallic. It's a very, very beautiful color. If you pour straight white mica pigments into white paint, you're never going to see them. The white will bleach out any of the mica pigments. So what we use is we use a clear urethane paint. Now, it's not clear coat. It's just a clear urethane paint with no color in it. And then we would dump the mica pigments into that. That would be your second stage. So you would get a white base coat, and then you would have a clear base coat with the mica pigments in it, and that's what gives it that white sparkly pop, because you have that clear coat over the top of it with the mica in it. And then you would use a urethane based clear coat that would harden on top of the surface and protect that from UV damage, rocks, chips, all that fun stuff. It's fair to note too, in all this, when we're discussing metallic paints, metallics actually have a higher UV resistance to fading in the sun than solid colors do. It's because the aluminum pigments actually reflect sunlight and protect the base coat underneath. So they actually stand up to sunlight much better than do, like for example, yellow fades so fast. Red, solid colors, they're going to fade really quick. And I think I have these listed in kind of order of importance and what you're going to see. Maybe I don't, I can't remember, but I wanted to include fisheye first because it's probably one of the most common problems that people are going to get. And these terms are really critical for you to see, hear, understand, and identify. So that way, when you go to doing this on your own, you can understand what your paint is telling you, because it's going to tell you a lot. Fisheyes are small circular crater-like openings that appear either during or shortly after you lay down a coat of paint or primer, though primer is often much more forgiving, especially with filler, body-filling primers, the gray primers and stuff like that. But basically, they're caused primarily by spraying over a surface that's contaminated with oil or grease, silicone, or wax. Note, the mold release agent on a new fiberglass body is a common culprit. So if you're doing fiberglass parts, you need to be aware of that. But it can also be caused by using thinner or reducer in place of wax and grease remover during your pre-paint preparation. And wipeout cleaner is probably one of the best things that you're going to find. You can buy it by the gallon from any auto body supply shop. It will not remove paint, but it will remove grease and wax and get a clean, sterile surface. This is critical. I don't care if you just wiped it, wipe it again. You're never going to remove the paint with this stuff, and it is great. Wipe it before you dip, wipe it before you prime, wipe it before you paint. It's called wipeout for a reason, and you want to wipe out any of the oil and grease. And if you do that, where you use a wet rag, a microfiber, lint-free wet rag to wipe on, wipe off. Wax on, wax off.
Wax on, wax off.
Wax on, wax off. Wax on, hot. Wax off. Hot. Concentrate. Look my eye. Lock hand. Thumb inside. Wax on. Hot. Wax off. Hot.
Just like that. Same theory here. So make sure you use wipeout. I used to buy it by the five gallon pails because I use it so much. And one thing with the wipeout cleaner, it helps to put it in a spray bottle. Because again, you can atomize the droplets and actually make it work a little bit longer and then wipe over it with your racks. So just a cheap little plastic spray bottle from Home Depot, fill it up with wipeout, mark it, boom, you're in there like swimwear. Though not as common, an occasional cause may also be painting over an existing finish where an additive like smoothie, a fisheye preventer, have been used. So that's another thing to look for. Most of the time, I never use fisheye preventers. They're just really expensive additives that you don't need. Wrinkling. This can happen. It can happen more often than not, and it's a pain in the butt to deal with. It's often referred to as lifting, is when an existing paint layer shrivels during the application of a new finish or as the new finish dries. This is caused by solvents in the new finish attacking the old finish. You'll most likely see this malady when recoating enamels or urethanes that are not fully cured, or if you have exceeded the maximum flash dry or recoat time during the application. So one thing I probably should have mentioned before is recoat times. Certain urethanes and paints have a recoat time before you actually have to stop what you're doing, sand it down or scuff it up with a Scotch-Brite pad prior to actually recoating it again. And that's where you get in trouble with wrinkling. Because if you let it go too far, and I've even had it to me after scuffing, I would scuff the old finish up and the solvents from the new urethane would actually attack the old finish and cause the wrinkling problem. So it's best to where if you got to start a job or if you mess up on a dip and you have to repaint, focus on that one job and get it done in dips before you hit that 24. Most of the time it's a 24-hour recoat window. So you want to try to get your jobs done efficiently as possible, because once you go outside of that recoat time, you start creating a whole slew of problems for yourself that you're not going to want, and your job's going to roll into a spiraling out of control disaster before you know it. But either way, I digress. In this situation, you'll have to strip and then refinish because there's no way to stop the wrinkling. This circumstance can be prevented by not exceeding a product's maximum recoat time during or after application, by not shooting lacquer over enamel or urethane, or avoid spraying under top coats excessively wet. So one thing I will say, if you know that you're going to be prone to wrinkling or you've gone a little past your recoat time, one thing I would suggest that you do is when you have to recoat, a very, very light misted coat. And if you got to do 5 light coats before you can put on 1 heavy coat, and I mean light, like you're barely getting it on there, because you're just trying to gradually introduce these solvents to the painted substrate of that old paint. And as you gradually do it, they're not going to be as aggressive in attacking the paint. And I've had some good success with that, but it doesn't always work. And you have to be really careful when painting over paint that's sat for more than probably 12, 16, 18 hours, because you will be susceptible to this problem. And it's a pain in the butt to deal with. Dieback is also known as dulling or hazing. It is the dulling of the finish's gloss or shine as it dries or ages. This one is pretty common and has quite a few different causes. I found that you'll be more susceptible to dieback if you don't allow adequate drying or curing time of your undercoat, or if you close up a freshly painted vehicle in a booth or garage with no air circulation. Because you got to think, these paints, they're giving off vapors. And if you enclose them to where they can't vent themselves, dieback can become a problem. The latter cause happens because in a sealed environment, the evaporating solvents from the new finish hang around in the air and react with the still drying paint surface, causing it to dull out. Other causes are too short of flash time between coats, using cheap off-brand thinners or reducers, and sometimes an excessively heavy or wet final coat. You can repair dieback by letting the finish dry thoroughly and cutting and buffing it, or you can sand and refinish. It's up to you, but you can also help to avoid the problem in the first place by applying your top coats according to the product's directions, allowing sufficient flash times between coats using the correct and/or recommended thinners and reducers, and of course making sure everything you've got good airflow around the vehicle as soon as it's tack-free. Checking, sometimes referred to as crow's feet, are basically cracks of various lengths and widths that show up in the top coat. If you've ever been to El Mirage or any other dry lake bed, you'll recognize the checking effect right off the bat. Okay, so this is one problem that has a number of possible causes. The most common causes are excessive film thickness, too short of a flash time between coats, force drying your undercoat, like using a blowgun or a dry primer, and sometimes by using too much hardener or catalyst in the primer or paint. The only way to fix checking is to strip all the crazed and cracked paint film and do the whole job over. So again, following directions here is critical because you can really get yourself into trouble. But either way, you can usually save yourself a whole lot of work by preventing the problem by actually reading and following all label instructions, by removing checked surfaces completely before you spray over them in the first place. And of course, by making sure your material, both undercoats and top coats, are thoroughly mixed before spraying. And right here, you can see images of what crow's feet in checking looks like. Sags. Okay, this is going to be a common problem of new painters everywhere. You're going to get sags. Sometimes people call them runs, hangers, curtains. There's numerous slang out there for them. Sags, along with dust, is one of the most prolific paint problems for the hobbyist and occasional painter. The most common causes are holding the gun too close to the surface, moving too slowly across the panel, and double coating an area. Over thinning, reducing is also a possible cause because your paint's thinner, it's not going to stick as well and it could sag, along with trying to paint in an environment that's too cold. Of course, I've had that happen before in Florida, really cold mornings. Boy, that sucks. To fight runs and sags, you've got to hold your gun perpendicular to the surface and keep steady contact. Everything should be in the wrist. You've got to hold your gun perpendicular to the surface and keep steady and correct distance from the panel, all while moving it fast enough that you don't pile the paint on, yet slow enough to get good coverage and flow, a process that comes with practice and experience. If you do sew some curtains, in some cases you can wipe the area with a solvent wetted rag and then clean and respray the area. Seldom of a first choice, or you can keep going and wait till the paint fully cures and then sand and buff this, or sand and respray that area, which that would be more recommended. But here you're going to see some pictures of what sags look like. Those are sags. They're really annoying, but you got to fix them. Excessive orange peel. Okay, so now we're getting into most clear coating. This orange peel is going to be known with clear coating. It can happen in paint, but it mainly pertains to clear coat. An excessive orange peeled surface has the appearance of an orange peel. Okay, this is normally a result of using too low of pressure or not reducing the paint enough. If it is not too severe, you might be able to correct it with wet sanding using about 1200 grit sandpaper, followed by buffing or respraying of the surface. Always stain your paint according to the instructions on the label and do not overcoat your surface. The most important thing to know is that most all clear coat jobs have some type of orange peel in the surface. You're never going to avoid it. And basically what you're going to see is when you look down the side of the panel or down the side of an object, you're going to see just unlevel portions in the clear coat. Not sags, runs, anything like that, but it's just going to be unlevel portions. And so when the clear coat looks like glass, it usually has been sanded and buffed for that hot rod clear coat effect. But if you look down your personal vehicle, especially around wheel wells and fenders, you're going to see it. You're going to see that orange peel effect. Now, it's not going to be as small as an orange. It's just going to kind of be exploded and drawn out over a bigger area. This up on the top right looks like a Mako paint job, and that is excessive orange peel. The bottom right is excessive orange peel, and the center left of this picture is 9 times out of 10, that was probably not factory, it's probably rework. You're going to get it. And the only way to contend with it is to buff it out or become a better painter. Edge mapping, also known as feather edge lifting or edge rising, is caused by solvent from a fresh top coat penetrating a sensitive area of an undercoat, most commonly the feathered edges of a repaired area. You'll recognize it as a wrinkled area outlining a repaired area. When painting a vehicle with repaired areas, meaning almost everything those of us who can't afford a new steel aftermarket body will end up painting. It's always a good idea to use 2-component primer surfacer, water-based primer surfacer, or an appropriate sealer that can create a barrier between the repair and the fresh top coat. So what we're saying is if you bring something to get a hydrographics job done, or maybe you're just going to do a paint job, and you have to use some type of a body filler or something like that, once you're done with that repair, spray a top coat of high build primer, the gray primer over the top of that, and then shoot a black coat of 50/50 epoxy sealer, the black, primer basically, and shoot that sealer over that high build top coat to lock your repair in to prevent edge mapping. Because if you don't do that, you're going to get edge mapping, period. If you do encounter edge mapping, you will have to sand smooth, remove the affected area, and seal it with a good barrier coat of some kind. Of course, your paint supplier will be able to recommend one for you. So anything that helps to prevent feather edge lifting is always final sand and repair with 400 grit or finer paper. The finer the final sanding, the shallower the sand scratches will be, and there will be less of an area for solvents to attack. So always keep that in mind. But this is what feather edge mapping looks like. So you're going to have a mottled kind of blotched area. In the center, it's going to be defined. You can see on the bottom blue portion where we put the Bondo in, we have our primer, and then we have our base coat, and then we have our clear coat over the top of that, and it just comes right through. Air trapping. Never really had an issue with this, but it can cause a problem, and it's usually caused by a curing issue. So air trapping causes small craters that are similar in appearance to fish eyes. These are caused by tiny air bubbles trapped in fresh paint film that rise to the surface and pop, causing small crater-like depressions. These craters are usually caused by under-atomization of the paint due to either too low of air pressure setting, improper spray gun adjustment, spraying with your gun too close to the surface, or moving your gun too slowly across the panel. Depending on its severity, crater can be repaired by either sanding with 1200 grit or finer paper, and then polishing to restore gloss, or by sanding and respraying the area. Now, you can avoid this problem by maintaining a correct spray gun speed and distance, making sure you've got the right cap, nozzle, needle, etc. set up for the type of product that you're spraying, and of course, making sure you are using the correct recommended air pressures. That's kind of what air trapping is going to look like. Like I said, I've never really had the problem before, but I don't know, maybe some people can. Sand scratches. These are a pain in the butt, especially when dealing with metallics. They really love to show up in metallic paints. These are going to show up as lines or marks in the paint film that mirror the marks on the surface being painted. They may also show up as streaks in the top coat that magnify marks in the undercoat or substrate layer. These are caused by improper or incomplete final sanding of bodywork or primer coats. Using too coarse a sandpaper, trying to cover scratches by filling them with primer, or in some cases by sanding single stage or base coat finishes before clearing them. You can't fix them by letting the finish cure and then carefully resanding that area until ultra-fine paper and then refinishing it. You can also avoid sand scratches by graduating your sanding from coarse to fine papers. So again, starting at 80 and working up to 600, 800, etc. And of course, not sanding base coat colors before clear coat. Once your base coat's down, you should not be sanding it at all. Now, a little caveat here though, but so if you have to sand the base coat for some reason, make sure you apply an additional base coat color before clearing. Use 1200 grit or finer paper for color sanding. Now, a primer, it's one thing. When you get down to your base coat, it's going to be a whole different monster. And these are what the sand scratches are going to appear like. Crazy. Make it crazy, right? A condition which cracks or lines of different lengths and direction form in the finish. This is caused by excessive film thickness of either a top coat or undercoat. It can also be caused by shooting over a previously crazed surface using too much hardener in either your primer or paint and not thoroughly mixing your spray materials or using off-brand or other brand of reducer or hardener in your mixture. The only way to correctly fix this paint problem is to strip the area and refinish it. And I mean down to the bare metal. You can usually prevent crazing by following the material manufacturer's label instructions by always using a manufacturer's complete line of products. not intermixing different brands, and making sure to mix your coatings completely before spraying. One caveat to this, for those of you out there that might start spraying candy colors, if you're using House of Colors brand paints and clear coats, you have to be careful, because when it comes down to applying the candy color is actually a urethane clear coat with a dye in it, and you have to use a hardener with that clear coat to get it to harden. Here's the caveat. If you use House of Colors brand hardener, which is way overpriced and expensive, to harden that clear coat, you have to use that same hardener in your clear coat, because if you don't, crazing is going to turn into a massive disaster. It's going to ruin your whole job, because what's going to happen is if you use your candy color, which is going to be that urethane clear with the House of Colors hardener, and then you go over the top of that candy color, because it's still going to be semi-wet. You can't let it set up fully, and you go over the top of that candy color with your brand of clear coat using that hardener. Those two chemicals are going to react, and it is going to turn into a disaster. And you're going to have about $200 in paint to $400 in paint down the toilet like that, and it is going to be a shit show. So the thing I can recommend is when you're dealing with candy colors and hardeners, whatever hardener you're going to use for your final clear coat, your final stage of paint, make sure you use that with the stage that is going to be the candy color clear coat. This is what crazing looks like, but it looks worse than that if you mix those two up. Peeling or delamination is a loss of adhesion between paint film and the substrate. And a lot of people will notice this on cars that were improperly clear coated. The clear coat starts flaking up. Okay, so this is what we're talking about. Causing sections of the paint to separate from the surface. Though all paint problems are aggravating, there's nothing worse than leaving the driveway with a shiny new paint job and arriving to the donut shop in a bare metal car. Peeling is most commonly caused by poor surface preparation, usually insufficient sanding or cleaning, but there are other causes too, like omitting or using the wrong primer for your substrate. The substrate being painted exceeding the paint product's recommended recoat time, or in the case of clear coat colors, spraying the clear coat to dry, using an incompatible clear coat, again talking about the House of Colors, or incorrect color coat reduction. You can prevent peeling again by reading the damn instructions for the products you're using. Properly cleaning and sanding your substrate, using the correct undercoats, primers, etc. for your substrate, and making sure your top coat is within the recommended flash times for the material that you're using. And here's just an example of peelings where you have a layer or subsequent layers peeling right off the car. Again, the clear coat illustration is one of the best. Pinholing occurs in and over body filler or putty when air bubbles are trapped inside the fillers during mixing. So when you're mixing body filler, you have to be really careful of this, because this can happen. These bubbles are then exposed during sanding, creating small holes or craters in the surface. Sometimes the air or gas trapped in these pinholes will affect the top coat by rising to the surface. Filler-caused pinholing problems are often created during the mixing of hardener when you whip the filler hardener mixture into a rapid circular motion. Keep in mind that you're not mixing a cake when you're mixing filler. Filler should be mixed consistently, folding the mixture over onto itself until the hardener is fully dispersed. Again, I know the hardeners on these fillers can set up excessively fast, but if it's doing that and it's fixed, setting up while you're still mixing, you're probably using too much hardener. It's just a pea-sized drop or about a 1 inch across the puddle. It takes a little getting used to, but you'll get used to it. Too much hardener will also cause pinholing to become more likely. One last possible cause is excessive filler thickness. Globbing on huge droplets of filler rather than trying to repair a dent produces a lot of heat as the filler hardener mixture catalyzes, and could cause gas formation and pinholing as well. If you do end up with pinholing and notice it before painting, you can basically apply a thin coat of spot putty or polyester glazing putty and sand it smooth, filling the pinholes and hopefully correcting the problem, though this route is more of a band-aid than a permanent fix. This is a good example of what pinholing is going to look like. Fine. Now we finally got to this. This is the number one issue, probably. This is going to be a continuous battle if you don't have good filtration equipment or a properly vetted paint booth. FOD is what's known as foreign objects debris, and it is basically crap in your paint. Crap in your paint is by far the most common of all paint headaches. With that said, all we can do is work to reduce the amount of dust and dirt as best we can. This can be accomplished by making sure your spray environment, which in most people's cases is going to be a garage or some makeshift room, is as clean as possible. Wet the damn floor down, wet the damn walls down. I don't care what you do, but water will trap dust temporarily. But just don't get any water on your part that you're painting. I've never had to do between coats. That's a little excessive, but it can happen sometimes. So make sure the vehicle surface is clean. And of course, I'm talking about all around the windows, the door, the hood, the trunk, the jambs, etc. if you're doing a vehicle. If not, whatever you're painting, make sure it's clean. If you're doing like a golf cart body, one thing that helps is the DeVilbiss static wipes that remove static electricity from the plastic body. So getting all the static off of those, there's even chemical static removers that you can get that are extremely expensive. It just depends on the amount of issues you're having. But usually static wipes will get the job done. Don't forget to tack off your masking paper and tape masked areas as well. As you use a fresh new tack rag as often as possible. So if your tack rag fell on the floor, it's getting dirty, it's best to use a tack rag to help prevent FOD, mitigate it. Another thing a lot of people don't think about is static electricity. Well, there we go. My point made. Really does come into play in this situation by actually attracting dust to the vehicle like a magnet. Running a ground strap from the chassis of your vehicle or your paint table to a good ground in the garage will help out more than you could ever imagine. I've tried it. I continue to do it and think it really does help. I used to have a metal 10-foot by 4-foot paint rack. It was all metal, and I had things I could slide airboat rudders, anything on there. I used to keep that grounded off while I was painting to it. Now, back when I was in my home-based business days, yeah, painting in a 2-car garage really sucked. But, you know, as I graduated in a full-time operation in Florida, I had a dust filtration, a paint filtration system that was mobile. That thing worked great until the filters get clogged up and you got to swap them out. But either way, you want to go for a completely dust-free paint job because it's going to save you a lot of time and labor buffing the clear coat and trying to get that dust out. Another thing, if you're painting at night and you live in the South, you're going to have lights on. Bugs love lights, and then they love to come in the booth. So make sure whatever area is contained to where you can't get bugs in there, because as soon as you start spraying clear coat or paint, they're going to want to drop right down onto that and ruin your complete paint job. So having some tweezers on hand where you can barely go in and pick a bug off if you have to, it's better, because if you got to pick a bug out of clear coat, it's harder to do it's really hard to re-clear coat the whole job versus buff a little area and make it look pretty again. So keep that in mind. Solvent popping. Solvent popping, or boiling as it's sometimes known, can be recognized by groups of small bubbles or crater-like openings in the paint surface. This condition is often caused by solvent getting trapped in the paint film when it skims over before all solvent is allowed to evaporate. The solvents left under the paint film rise up, ultimately popping through the surface and leaving pinholes or craters. This is caused by the paint film shrinking over because either too fast a reducer or thinner was used, or there was an excessive air movement over and around the vehicle that dried the surface before the buried solvents had time to evaporate. This situation can be fixed by allowing the affected area to dry or cure fully, and then sanding and refinishing as needed. Or if it's severe, you may have to strip the affected area and then prime, seal, and recoat as needed. This is what solvent popping looks like. You're just going to have those air bubbles, too much solvent in there, it pops up to the surface and destroys a clear coat job easily. Modeling, also referred to as streaking or floating or zebra striping, is a streaked, spotty, or stripped appearance that shows up in a metallic or candy transparent finish. It is a tough one to show in an image, but in the case of metallics, it's when the flake flows unevenly in the wet top coat, resulting in pooling or fouling outward into a sort of ring, leaving some areas with less flake and some with more, causing light and dark areas. Modeling with candies is more apt to look like zebra stripes rather than flowing or pooling you see with metallics. Modeling can be caused by a bunch of factors. Among them are an unbalanced spray pattern, tilting the spray gun so the fan is heavier either at the top or the bottom, of the pattern, over thinning or reducing the finish, applying a clear coat before the base coat has completely flashed, and improper overlap when making your passes. You can help prevent mottling by using the correct needle nozzle air cap combination in your spray gun, adjusting it for the proper spade pattern, keeping it perpendicular to the surface being sprayed, using the recommended thinning reducing ratio when mixing your material, and allowing proper flash dry times before. If you do end up with a mottling problem with a metallic color, you may be able to rectify it with a higher pressure mist coat while your previous coat is still wet, or allow the base coat to flash and come back with a lower pressure mist coat. Just remember, if you allow a mottled panel to completely dry, you will have to sand and refinish it from scratch. This is kind of a good representation of mottling. It's not a good representation of mottling, but it's about the best I can get. Blistering, sometimes called pimples or bubbles, are swelled areas that show up in the paint surface weeks or months after the paint job. They're caused by moisture that's been trapped under the paint surface and is sometimes caused by spraying during really high humidity conditions. It can also be caused by contaminated air lines, failure to drain your compressor, or by painting over an unclean or contaminated surface. Blistering can sometimes be repaired by sanding the affected area and refinishing, but usually has to actually strip the area to its bare substrate and start from scratch. This malady can be prevented by always draining your air compressor and air lines daily. If not, especially in high humidity conditions, you might have to do this twice a day. Proper cleaning and prepping before painting, making sure everything is totally dry after wet sanding, and making sure that you use the correct thinner and reducer for your spray conditions. This is a good representation of blistering. Discoloration, or bleed through, is a yellowish stain that appears in the top coat over areas repaired using a glazing putty or body filler. It's caused by too much, or the opposite, too little hardener in the putty or filler. It can also be caused by an incomplete mixing of either, or from priming before the filler or putty is fully cured. In minor cases, it may disappear as the top coat fully cures, but normally you'll have to sand, seal, and refinish the area. You can usually eliminate the bleed through by making sure you don't use excessive amounts of cream hardener, by mixing fillers or putty completely, or by sealing any repair areas before painting. Of course, there's going to be your discoloration. Blushing is a common problem when spraying high humidity conditions. It happens when the air and evaporated solvents from the spray gun lowers the temperature of the surface being painted to below the dew point, the temperature at which the air becomes saturated and produces water, basically. This condition causes condensation in or on the paint layer, producing a smoky or mild, almost like a milky looking cloud on the surface of the paint. Blushing can normally be corrected by adding a bit of retarder, which is basically it slows down the evaporating solvent to your paint mixture and then recoating it, or by letting the finish cure and then compounding and buffing. One thing on this, there's slow, medium, and fast solvents that you can obtain, and they're meant for different temperature and humidity conditions. So the best thing to do is get with your local body shop and find out what types of solvents are best to use at what times during the year. And they'll give you, your local body shop is really more or less your partner in your business with you. At least a good one's going to be, because they're going to help you work through all these little tiny problems by making sure you get the right solvents at the right times of year. And that, if you don't have directions on your paint, they're going to give you the directions to use the paint and all that, because they attend all these factory trainings and do all this stuff. So it's good to find a really good local auto body supply shop if you're going to be in Hydrographics, because they can really help you a lot with your business. You can prevent the blushing by using a good quality thinner and reducer that's correct for your conditions, adding the recommended amount of retarder when spraying in humid conditions, or by applying heat after application to help evaporate excess moisture. That's a good illustration of blushing. And so that's going to be it for this video. It's getting kind of long, so what we're going to do is we're going to break up paint procedure into a different video. So go ahead and look for part 2 to this video next, coming up, and we'll see you in part 2.